When a person knows the clock is running out, every choice suddenly becomes a confession, and nothing reveals more than what they ask for on their final plate. Some pick childhood comfort as if trying to crawl back to a time before everything shattered. Others demand lavish feasts that feel more like declarations of pride than hunger. And a few make choices so strange they leave investigators arguing decades later. These last meals aren't just food, they're fragments of fear, ego, regret, and secrets people carry into their final moments. And the stories behind them say far more than the official records ever could. Some people spend their whole lives building a mask, and even in their final days, they refuse to take it off. One of the most unsettling examples was a man who made children laugh for a living, slipping into bright costumes and painting on a smile that hid everything he really was. Behind that cheerful persona lived someone capable of horrors no one imagined. After his arrest, investigators found a calmness that felt almost unnatural. No panic, no guilt, just a man quietly painting clowns as if nothing in his life had ever gone wrong. And when it came time for his last meal, he didn't pick comfort food or something meaningful. He chose the same fried chicken he once served while managing fast food restaurants, like he was clinging to the one version of himself the world didn't fear. It was a strange loyalty, unsettling in its simplicity. But the next story wouldn't be simple at all, because the execution itself turned into a nightmare no one in the room ever forgot. Some criminals meet their end quietly, but Alan Davis's final moments turned into one of the most disturbing scenes ever witnessed in an execution chamber. His crimes were brutal, an entire family wiped out without hesitation, but what happened afterward shocked the nation even more. When he was strapped into the electric chair, no one expected the horror that followed. The current surged, his body convulsed violently, and when the power cut off, he was still alive. Blood poured from his nose and mouth as witnesses looked on in disbelief, realizing the execution had gone terribly wrong. Minutes dragged by before he finally died, turning his last moments into a public debate about the limits of so-called humane punishment. Yet just hours earlier, Davis had indulged in an extravagant seafood feast: lobster, shrimp, clams, garlic bread, all washed down with a massive root beer. It was a meal that felt indifferent, almost arrogant, coming from a man responsible for such cruelty. But the next case shows that some people orchestrate violence in an even stranger way, by getting others to do the killing for them. Some crimes are carried out with cold precision, but Teresa Lewis' plan felt disturbingly casual from the very beginning. Instead of hiring professionals or plotting in secret, she met her accomplices in a Walmart aisle, two men willing to take lives in exchange for a payout. Her scheme was simple: open the door at midnight, let them in, and collect the insurance money once her husband and stepson were gone. But reality never follows the script. When officers arrived, her husband was still clinging to life, and with his final breath he exposed everything. From that moment, Lewis' fate was sealed. On death row, she lived in total isolation, the only woman in a unit built for men, while psychologists described her as someone easily manipulated, with a mind that never fully grasped the weight of what she'd done. When her last meal arrived, she didn't choose luxury or excess. She asked for fried chicken, peas with butter, Dr. Pepper, and apple pie, as if reaching for a memory from a life she'd lost long before her crimes began. But the next story shows how a final choice can reveal not comfort, but the unraveling of a mind that once fooled almost everyone. Some criminals rely on violence, but Ted Bundy relied on charm, an unsettling weapon that worked far too well. With a clean-cut smile and the confidence of someone who always believed he'd talk his way out of anything, he manipulated everyone around him. Victims, investigators, even the courtroom itself. He staged injuries with arm casts, faked authority with police badges, and escaped custody twice, convinced he could outrun accountability forever. But once every appeal failed and the countdown began, the mask he'd worn for years started to crack. While most inmates choose a final meal filled with nostalgia or indulgence, Bundy refused anything special. He accepted the standard tray: steak, eggs, hash browns, and barely touched it. For a man who'd always tried to control the narrative, this sudden lack of appetite felt like the only honest moment he ever had. Maybe fear finally caught up. Maybe the charm didn't work on himself anymore. But whatever he felt, the next story brings a completely different kind of criminal, one whose final request was so oddly innocent it stunned the entire country. Timothy McVeigh didn't fit the pattern of a silent, hidden killer. His attack was loud, calculated, and meant to send a message that shook the entire country. The explosion he set off in Oklahoma City destroyed a federal building, took hundreds of lives, and left the nation staring at a level of devastation no one expected from a single man. Investigators eventually traced him through one tiny detail, a serial number on a truck axle that survived the blast. That overlooked scrap of metal unraveled his entire plan in a matter of days. But what confused people even more was his last meal. No steak, no feast, nothing extravagant, just 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. Cold, simple, almost childish. For someone who caused so much destruction in the name of ideology, the choice felt strangely hollow, like a final moment where the bravado fell away and nothing was left but a flavor he liked. But the next case didn't end with a clear motive or a clear villain. Instead, it sparked a global debate that still divides people nearly a century later. Some executions close a case forever, but others ignite a storm that refuses to die. The story of Sacco and Vanzetti belonged to that second category, a case where 2 immigrant men were swept into a murder trial during one of the most fear-driven chapters in American history. The evidence was thin, the emotions were high, and almost immediately the world split in two. On one side were officials insisting justice had been served, on the other were millions across continents, marching, protesting, and begging for the verdict to be overturned. Even decades later, governors and historians openly questioned whether the men ever committed the crime at all. And yet, for their final meal, nothing dramatic was recorded. Just soup, meat, toast, and tea, basic details so ordinary they vanished in the archives, swallowed by time. All that remained was the silence around what really happened and the lingering question of whether 2 innocent men were sent to their deaths. But the next story pushes the debate even further, because it asks whether someone who no longer understood reality should have been executed at all. Some crimes are committed with intention, but Ricky Ray Rector's story became a question of morality rather than motive. After killing a man during a dispute, he agreed to turn himself in, until he suddenly shot the officer who came to take him into custody. Then, in a moment no one could explain, he turned the gun on himself. The shot didn't end his life, but it destroyed the part of his brain responsible for judgment and understanding. From that moment on, Rector lived in a fog where consequences didn't exist, and the concept of death meant nothing. Experts said he couldn't fully grasp why he was on trial, yet the legal system pushed forward anyway. Years later, as political pressure mounted, his execution became a public statement rather than a search for fairness. What struck everyone most was his last meal. Rector ate everything on the tray: steak, fried chicken, Kool-Aid, except the pecan pie. When a guard asked why, he smiled and said he was saving it for later. He truly believed there would be a later. That small piece of uneaten dessert became the most heartbreaking symbol of a man who no longer understood the world around him. But not every inmate's final request carried tragedy. Some chose meals so bizarre that even investigators were left guessing. Not every last meal reveals regret or fear, some just leave people confused. Stephen Wayne Anderson, a man responsible for multiple killings, didn't ask for anything symbolic or nostalgic. Instead, he ordered a combination so strange it felt like a riddle: grilled cheese sandwiches, cottage cheese, hominy grits, peach pie, chocolate chip ice cream, and a handful of radishes. That last detail fascinated everyone. Radishes aren't the kind of food people reach for in their final hours. They don't comfort, they don't indulge, they barely taste like anything unless you grew up eating them. Some believed it was a childhood memory surfacing at the end. Others thought it was simply his odd personal preference. But the truth is no one knows. Anderson never explained the choice, leaving behind a plate that felt more like a puzzle than a statement. And while his selections were bizarre, the next story takes a completely different turn, because it centers on a man who refused to take even a single bite. Most inmates face their last meal with some form of acceptance, whether it's denial, nostalgia, or one final attempt at comfort. But Ángel Diaz refused all of it. His case had been shaky from the start. Witnesses with questionable credibility, evidence that didn't line up, and a conviction many believed was built more on assumptions than facts. For more than 20 years on death row, he insisted he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. And when the moment finally came for him to choose a final meal, he pushed the tray away. Guards brought him the standard dinner anyway, but he refused that too. It was his last message to the world, a quiet act of defiance from a man who believed the justice system had failed him. No indulgence, no comfort, no ritual, only silence. Whether it was protest or hopelessness, no one knows for certain. But the next story takes the idea of a final meal to its most haunting extreme, because it centers on a man whose last request became a legend. Some final meals are indulgent, some are defiant, and some become stories people whisper about for decades. Victor Figuere's choice belonged to that last category. After drifting from town to town, He lured a doctor into a trap that ended in tragedy, a crime so senseless that even the governor begged for clemency on moral grounds. But the decision was pushed higher, all the way to President John F. Kennedy, who ultimately refused to intervene. When McVeigh faced his final question, "What do you want for your last meal?" he didn't ask for steak, sweets, or anything that hinted at comfort. He requested a single olive. One small olive with the pit still inside. No one could make sense of it. Some believed he hoped an olive tree would grow from the pit, a symbol of peace sprouting from a life defined by violence. Others saw it as a final attempt to leave behind something pure in a world he had damaged. But the truth went with him to the grave. All that remained was that lone olive, a quiet, unsettling reminder that even at the end, human beings can be impossible to understand. And in that mystery, there's something every final meal has in common. When you look at all these final meals side by side, it becomes clear they were never really about food. They were snapshots of who these people were in their last quiet moment, fragments of guilt, pride, denial, nostalgia, or a desperate need to control one final choice when everything else had already been decided. Some reached for comfort from a life long gone. Some tried to make a statement. Some refused the ritual altogether. And a few left behind symbols that still spark arguments today. But whatever they chose, each last meal became a tiny window into the human mind at the edge of the end, a place where fear, memory, and identity collide in ways no courtroom or headline can ever truly explain. And maybe that's why these stories linger, not because of the food itself, but because of what it reveals about people when there's nothing left to hide.